The day began like any other, with the soft hum of the alarm clock pulling Thomas out of his sleep. He stretched, his body still heavy with the remnants of the dreams that clung to him. His eyes squinted in the soft morning light filtering through the blinds. His apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that Thomas had grown used to in his 34 years of life. No family, no friends visiting. Just the silence of a man who had settled into a life of solitude. Thomas McAllister was a man who had always valued his independence. He had built his life around the idea of being self-sufficient and self-reliant, rarely needing the company of others. His career as a freelance graphic designer allowed him to work from home, keeping his days relatively peaceful. But there was a hole in his life that he could never quite fill. A constant yearning for something more, something that he could never define. He wasn't particularly lonely, but there were times when the silence felt more oppressive than comforting. He had no particular fondness for socializing or interacting with others. Instead, he would retreat to his work, pouring himself into his designs, finding comfort in the pixelated world he could control. But something always felt missing, like a part of himself he couldn't access, no matter how much he tried. This morning, as Thomas stood up from his bed, he rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the sleep that still clung to him. He glanced at the clock, 7:30 a.m. A little later than usual, the day stretched before him, empty and unremarkable. His usual routine would unfold, but something about today felt different. A nagging feeling in the pit of his stomach. He couldn't quite place it. The apartment was small but cozy, with minimalistic furniture and neutral-coloured walls. A few bookshelves filled with novels lined the walls, and a large mirror hung opposite his bedroom door. It was an antique, a piece he had bought years ago when he first moved in. He had always been drawn to mirrors, perhaps because they reflected something that seemed constant in a world that was ever-changing. As he moved to the bathroom, Thomas saw his reflection in the hallway mirror. The man who stared back at him looked like him, sure, but there was something off. The eyes, the expression, the posture. It was like a stranger looking back at him. He shook it off, dismissing it as nothing more than sleepiness clouding his perception. "Get a grip, Thomas," he muttered to himself. But even as he spoke the words, he couldn't shake the odd feeling that had taken hold of him. He had always been the kind of person who prided himself on being rational, logical, but there was something today that felt wrong. With a sigh, he made his way to the kitchen and began preparing his usual breakfast, a cup of coffee and toast. The hum of the kettle, the click of the toaster, the rhythmic sounds of his morning routine. Everything seemed to be playing out like a scene from a movie. But no matter how mundane the actions were, Thomas couldn't escape the strange feeling that clung to him, like a shadow he couldn't outrun. He took a sip of his coffee and stared out the window. The city was alive with motion, people going about their business, cars honking, buses rumbling down the street. It was the kind of morning that seemed to promise nothing out of the ordinary. Yet Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. "Your London for London at London Bridge at 11. He shook his head, willing himself to focus. There was no reason to get anxious. There was no reason to feel unsettled. But the feeling persisted. His thoughts were interrupted when he finished breakfast and went to clean his dishes. As he moved toward the sink, he glanced at the mirror again. But this time, his reflection was different. The man staring back at him wasn't him at all. Thomas froze. His heart skipped a beat as he took a step closer, his eyes narrowing. The reflection that stood in the mirror was older, much older. His hair, once dark and thick, was now greying, and his face bore the creases of a life lived in stress. His posture was hunched, as though years of wear and tear had taken their toll. It wasn't him. It couldn't be. "What is this?" Thomas whispered, his voice trembling. He reached out a hand to touch the surface of the mirror, but the reflection did not mimic him. It didn't move. Instead, it simply stared back at him with a cold, knowing gaze. Panicked, Thomas turned away, stumbling backward. He rushed to his bedroom, where another mirror hung on the wall, and glanced at it quickly. This time, The reflection was not older. It was younger, much younger. A version of Thomas that looked like he had just graduated from college. His face was free of lines, his eyes bright with optimism and energy. "Is this a joke?" Thomas muttered, backing away slowly. His breath came faster now, his heart pounding in his chest. What was happening? Why were the mirrors showing him different versions of himself? "Hello?" said Thomas. Frantic, he ran to the bathroom, checking every mirror in sight. Some showed him as a middle-aged man, others as a teenager, and one even showed him as an elderly man, his body frail and worn. Each reflection was a distorted version of the man he knew himself to be. Thomas pressed his hands to his face, as though he could wipe away the confusion that clouded his mind. "Is someone playing a prank on me?" he demanded aloud, his voice cracking with fear, but no one answered. Suddenly, it hit him. His life was being fractured in front of his very eyes. He didn't know how or why, but the world he had always known had splintered. Each reflection was a piece of him, a version he didn't recognize, a man he had never been, or would ever be. He wasn't sure what to do, where to go. How did he go about helping Ezra? He found himself clinging to the ring bow, but was before he could find the words. The only thing he knew for sure was that everything had just changed. Thomas stumbled back from the mirror, his mind racing. He could feel the sweat gathering at the back of his neck, his pulse hammering in his temples. What was happening? The air in the room felt thicker, as if the very atmosphere was shifting, stretching, twisting with each passing second. He reached out to steady himself on the edge of his bed, but it offered him no comfort. His world, once anchored by the predictability of routine, was suddenly unrecognizable. He looked around his apartment, each item seemingly unchanged. The coffee cup still sat on the kitchen counter, the books on his shelves were in their usual places, and yet the familiar world he had built for himself felt distant, as though he were in a dream. His breath came in shallow bursts, and he felt a sharp, gnawing sense of panic gnaw at him. He needed to understand what was going on, but the confusion clouded his thoughts. He felt a compulsion to get away from the mirrors, away from whatever distorted reality had emerged in his apartment. As he backed away from the hallway mirror, he passed the living room, where a large mirror hung above the fireplace. He didn't want to look at it, but he couldn't help himself. He turned his head slowly, unwillingly, and his eyes locked onto the glass. This time, the reflection wasn't just different, it was foreign. Thomas swallowed hard, stepping away in horror. He looked at the mirror again, hoping it would return to normal, but it didn't. The stranger stared back at him with an intensity that seemed to pierce through him. He was no longer just confused. He was terrified. What is this?" Thomas whispered, his voice barely audible. "Why is this happening?" He turned and ran out of the apartment, not stopping to grab his jacket or shoes. His mind raced as he stumbled down the stairs, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had to get away, had to clear his head. The city felt suffocating, its towering buildings and bustling streets closing in on him. Everything around him felt so normal. People walked past him without a second glance, lost in their own routines, while Thomas felt like he was the only one out of place. As he wandered aimlessly, the city became a blur of movement and noise. The streets that had always felt familiar now seemed foreign, alien even. He couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong, something that no one else could see. He had to understand what was happening to him. The mirrors. Why did they show different versions of himself? Were they just reflections, or were they telling him something he couldn't yet comprehend? His mind continued to spiral as he walked, trying to distract himself from the fear that clawed at him, but nothing worked. The world around him, despite its normalcy, felt distant. He felt disconnected, like a stranger in his own skin. Eventually, he found himself in a small park, the green grass and tall trees offering some semblance of calm. He sank onto a bench, his hands trembling as he rested them on his lap. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled shadows across the path. But even the serene scene failed to soothe him. His thoughts were like a whirlwind, tearing through his mind. He closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing. Focus, Thomas. Focus. The mirrors. There had to be a reason why he was seeing so many different versions of himself. He couldn't make sense of it, but he knew deep down that he couldn't ignore it. That's when the first message came. A voice, quiet but clear, echoed in his mind. You need to understand the truth. Only then will you find peace. Thomas jumped, looking around in confusion. The voice hadn't come from anyone nearby. It was in his head, a voice that seemed to know him in ways that no one could. His heart raced again. What truth? What was it trying to tell him? As his mind continued to reel, he heard footsteps approaching. He turned to find an elderly woman walking slowly down the path, a cane in her hand. She smiled warmly at him, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. There was something about her presence that made him feel strangely at ease. He didn't know why, but something told him that she might know something about what was happening to him. Without thinking, he stood up and walked toward her, his legs unsteady. "Excuse me, ma'am," he began, his voice shaking. "I don't know who to turn to. Something is happening to me. I'm seeing different versions of myself in the mirrors. I don't know what's real anymore. Can you help me?" The woman didn't seem surprised. In fact, she appeared almost expectant, as though she'd been waiting for him to speak. She nodded slowly, her wise eyes never leaving his. "Ah, I see," she said, her voice soft but filled with a quiet authority. "The mirrors can show us many things, Thomas, but only when we are ready to see them. And it seems you are not yet ready." "No, ready? What do you mean? What is happening to me?" he demanded, his frustration rising. "I'm losing my mind. I don't know what's real." The woman smiled gently. "The mirrors are not just glass, child. They are windows into your soul, into the many facets of who you are. What you see is not always what is true, but a reflection of what you believe yourself to be." Thomas stood frozen, trying to process her words. He felt a mixture of fear, confusion, and disbelief. Was she talking about some kind of metaphor? Was this all just some twisted dream? "Why now?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Why am I seeing these things now? Why haven't I noticed them before?" "Because you are on the edge of something," the woman said, her voice steady. "You are about to confront your true self, and that is never easy. But only by facing all the parts of who you are, good and bad, can you find peace." The words hung in the air between them, the weight of their meaning sinking in. Thomas didn't fully understand, but something deep within him stirred. He had always thought he knew who he was, but maybe, just maybe, there was more to him than he had ever realized. The woman's eyes softened as she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Go back to your apartment, Thomas. Look into the mirrors again. But this time, ask yourself, what do you see? And what do you wish to see?" With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Thomas to process her cryptic words. He stood there for a moment, the quiet hum of the city surrounding him. It felt like the beginning of something. He wasn't sure what, but he knew he couldn't turn back now. Taking a deep breath, he made his way back to his apartment, the question echoing in his mind. What do I see? And what do I wish to see? Thomas returned to his apartment, his heart still racing, his mind swirling with questions. The elderly woman's words echoed in his mind like a mantra. What do you see? And what do you wish to see? It was like she had unlocked something deep within him, a door to a place he hadn't wanted to acknowledge. But now the question clung to him, and he knew he couldn't avoid it any longer. The mirrors were waiting. He was honest with himself about how much he couldn't wait for the end. He stepped into his apartment, and the familiar scent of coffee and old books greeted him. Yet, everything felt different now. The air seemed thicker, charged with an electric tension. It was as if the walls themselves were watching him, waiting for him to make the next move. The hallway mirror was the first one he approached. He stared at it, his hands trembling slightly as he reached out to touch the cool glass. The reflection staring back at him was the same as before, his own face, tired and drawn, his eyes clouded with confusion and fear. But something was different this time. There was a slight shift, a subtle change in the way he looked. His face seemed more resigned, as if he had already given up. He drew in a sharp breath, stepping away from the mirror. His thoughts spun faster, and he felt a rising sense of urgency. He needed to know more, to understand what was happening. What had the woman meant by the many facets of who you are? Obiang. Thomas moved through the apartment, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He reached the living room mirror, the one that had first shown him the wild-eyed stranger. This time, he didn't hesitate. He stepped up to the mirror, his face inches away from the glass. He held his breath, bracing himself for what he might see. He reached the foyer toward the fireplace, his eyes flicking to the mirror, his face inches away from the glass. At first, nothing happened. The same face stared back at him, but the expression was colder, more distant. Then, something flickered in the reflection, and he blinked. The man in the mirror changed. His eyes became darker, and the lines on his face deepened, as if aged by years of hardship. This version of Thomas was angry, almost resentful, as if he was glaring at the man who dared to look back at him. Thomas stepped back, his heart pounding. This wasn't just a reflection. It was a distortion, a different version of himself, one that he didn't recognize. But that wasn't all. He could feel something stirring within him, a mixture of fear and something else, something darker, more primal. Was this who he could become if he let his anger and frustration consume him? The thought made him shudder. His mind raced as he moved to the next mirror. The bedroom mirror, a full-length mirror hanging on the back of the door, was the one that had unsettled him the most. He approached it cautiously, his hand sweating as he gripped the doorknob. He could feel his pulse quicken as he slowly opened the door, revealing the mirror that had been the most unsettling of all. He hesitated before stepping in front of it. This time, he didn't want to look, but the pull was irresistible. Slowly, he raised his eyes to meet his reflection. The little stilted marks faded from his eyes. At first, everything seemed normal, but then, the version of himself in the mirror began to shift. His hair grew longer, wilder, and his face became twisted in a grotesque smile that was both familiar and foreign. His eyes were wide, almost manic, as though he were someone else entirely, someone broken and desperate. Thomas recoiled, a wave of nausea sweeping over him. He had to get out. He couldn't stand it anymore. But as he turned to leave, something stopped him. He heard the voice again, soft but clear, echoing in his mind. You must confront all versions of yourself. Only then will you understand. The voice wasn't the woman's. This voice was colder, more distant, like an echo from deep within him. He stumbled back into the living room, his head spinning. What did that mean? He had to confront all versions of himself? Was that even possible? His eyes flew open, and he met Penhurst's eyes. His thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He froze, his breath caught in his throat. No one ever came to visit him. He rarely saw anyone, and he certainly hadn't invited anyone over today. He moved cautiously to the door, peeking through the peephole. His heart skipped a beat when he saw who stood on the other side. It was his best friend, Adam, someone he hadn't seen in years. Thomas, are you there? Adam's voice came through muffled, but the familiarity of it was a lifeline in the madness that had begun to engulf him. I'm here. Adam. Thomas hesitated. Should he answer? What would he say? How could he explain the madness unfolding inside his own apartment? But before he could think any further, Adam knocked again, more urgently this time. I know you're in there, man. Open up. Adam's voice was laced with concern. Reluctantly, Thomas opened the door, and Adam stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. He was tall, with shaggy dark hair and a carefree demeanor that Thomas had always admired. But today, Something was off. Adam's usual easygoing smile was replaced with a look of deep concern. "Dude, what's going on? You look terrible," Adam said, his eyes scanning the apartment. "You haven't been answering my texts. I've been trying to reach you for days. What's happened to you?" Thomas couldn't find the words to explain. How could he? How could he tell his best friend that he was seeing different versions of himself in the mirrors, versions that were slowly consuming him? I don't know, Adam," Thomas stammered, his voice weak. "I don't know what's happening. I keep seeing different versions of myself. In the mirrors. I can't make sense of it." Adam's brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean? Different versions? Like you're not feeling well or something? Maybe you need some rest. Have you been sleeping?" "No," Thomas replied, shaking his head. "It's not that. It's like they're not just reflections. They're different, and it's driving me crazy." Adam stepped closer, his expression softening. "Okay, look, let's sit down, talk about it, but you need to calm down first. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out, but you need to trust me." Thomas nodded numbly, grateful for his friend's support, but deep down, a nagging fear gnawed at him. How could Adam understand what was happening? Would anyone? As they sat down on the couch, Thomas felt a flicker of hope, but just as quickly, the dark feeling of uncertainty returned. What was he supposed to do now? What could he do? To stop the mirrors from controlling his life? And as if in answer, the voice whispered again, "The answers lie within the mirrors. You just need to be brave enough to face them all." Was he brave enough? Thomas didn't know, but the time had come to find out. Adam watched Thomas with growing concern, but he didn't push him to explain further. There was something undeniably off about his friend, something in his eyes that suggested a deep struggle. Adam, who had known Thomas for years, couldn't ignore the creeping fear that something much more serious than a simple mental breakdown was at play. "Thomas, man," Adam said gently, leaning forward. "You've been acting weird ever since you moved into this place. Are you sure it's the mirrors? I mean, have you thought about, I don't know, maybe getting some help? Talking to someone? A therapist, maybe?" Adam's eyes narrowed in surprise. "What's that?" Thomas felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The idea of talking to a therapist seemed so far-fetched now. How could he explain the unexplainable? How could anyone understand what was happening to him? "I don't think it's that simple," Thomas replied, his voice shaking. It's like there's something wrong with this apartment. Or maybe with me." Adam raised an eyebrow, clearly unconvinced. "With you? Dude, you're freaking me out a little. Look, we've been friends for a long time. Whatever it is, we can figure it out together. But you have to trust me." Thomas felt a wave of emotion crash over him. Relief, mixed with a deep, gnawing dread. Could he trust anyone with this? Could Adam truly understand the torment he was going through? But as Adam's words echoed in his mind, Thomas felt a flicker of hope. Maybe he wasn't alone in this after all. Maybe he didn't have to face the darkness by himself. Politer. "All right," Thomas said after a long pause, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll show you." Adam nodded, his eyes steady and supportive. Thomas stood and motioned for him to follow. Together, they made their way to the hallway mirror, the one that had started it all. The air seemed to thicken as Thomas reached for the frame, his pulse quickening. His hands were clammy, but he didn't want to hesitate. Adam needed to see this. Adam needed to understand. Thomas touched the mirror. He hesitated for a moment before looking up. The man who looked back at him seemed different. His face was weary, but there was something else. A faint flicker of something darker lurking in his eyes. Adam's expression faltered, confusion replacing the concern in his face. What is this?" "It's just you, man." "No, it's not just me," Thomas said, his voice trembling. I don't know what's happening. I see other versions of myself, and they don't feel like reflections. They feel real, like they're alive." Adam shook his head. trying to make sense of the words. "I don't get it, Thomas. This doesn't make sense." Thomas felt the familiar sense of dread creeping back into his chest. How could he explain something that didn't make sense to anyone else? It was like trying to describe a nightmare to someone who had never experienced one. But before he could say anything more, the reflection shifted. The face in the mirror warped again. But this time, it wasn't just a subtle change. The Thomas in the mirror smiled, a cruel, twisted grin that made Thomas's stomach turn. The version of him in the reflection seemed to grow darker, almost menacing, as if it were taunting him. "Thomas," Adam said, his voice low, laced with worry. "What's happening? That's not you, right?" Thomas shook his head, his heart racing. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the mirror. The reflection seemed to laugh silently, its grin widening, its eyes gleaming with a malicious glint. Thomas could feel the pull, the sense of inevitability, as though the version of himself in the mirror was drawing him in. "No," Thomas muttered, his voice hoarse. "No, this isn't me. This isn't who I am." "Hey, Adam said, grabbing his shoulder and pulling him away from the mirror. "Let's get out of here, okay? This is getting too weird, man. I think you need some air, or we need to..." Suddenly, the reflection shifted again, but this time, it wasn't Thomas's face staring back. It was Adam's. "What the hell?" Adam gasped, stumbling backward, his eyes wide with disbelief. That's me? I don't understand." "You die," he gasped. Thomas's chest tightened. The reflection of Adam in the mirror wasn't the same as the real Adam standing beside him. It was a version of Adam, haggard, older, eyes sunken and weary. It was as though the mirror was reflecting some twisted version of his friend's future, a dark, distorted future that felt all too real. "No," Thomas said, backing away. "This isn't real. This isn't how things are supposed to be." The reflection of Adam in the mirror blinked slowly, its expression empty and hollow. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. Was the mirror showing them a glimpse of what could be? Or was it revealing something far worse? Something that neither of them could escape? Adam stepped closer to the mirror, his face pale. "What the hell is going on?" he murmured. "What does this mean?" Before Thomas could answer, the reflection of Adam in the mirror seemed to smirk. Thomas turned to face his friend, his mind spinning. "I don't know, Adam, but I think whatever this is, it's not over." Adam looked at him, his expression no longer just worried, but fearful. "What do you mean? What do we do now?" "Yeah." Thomas took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He didn't have all the answers, but one thing was certain. He couldn't keep running from the reflections. The mirrors were telling him something, and he needed to confront it. No matter how terrifying it was, no matter how dark the versions of himself and his friends became, he couldn't ignore it anymore. "I think we need to face the truth," Thomas said, his voice steady now, though his heart still raced in his chest. "We need to confront what these versions of ourselves are showing us. We need to see it through. We need to see after." Adam swallowed hard. "You mean face whatever's in the mirrors? You really think that's the answer?" The lady smiled. "Happiness is inside. Honestly, I don't know," Thomas said, his voice quiet but firm. "But I have to try." With that, they both turned to face the hallway mirror once more. The room felt colder now, the air thick with anticipation. They had come too far to turn back, and as Thomas gazed into the glass, he braced himself for whatever came next. Thomas stood before the mirror, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the weight of the world pressing down on him, his mind racing with 1,000 questions. What would happen when they finally faced the reflection? What would happen when they finally faced the reflection? What would happen when they finally faced the twisted versions of themselves that seemed to haunt the glass? Adam stood beside him, equally tense, his eyes wide with fear. The room felt impossibly quiet, the only sound the distant hum of the apartment building's creaky pipes. Thomas could feel the air growing colder, a shiver running down his spine, as if the mirror itself were alive, watching them. The surface of the glass seemed to ripple, warping the reflection of the room and the two men standing in front of it. No, the first version of Thomas appeared in the mirror, a distorted, hollow-eyed version of himself, a cruel grin plastered across its face. His reflection felt like an enemy, a dark presence that had been quietly lurking beneath the surface all along. But this time, it wasn't just the reflection that unnerved him. He could feel it, feel the pull from the mirror, as if the version of himself inside the glass was trying to drag him in. I can't do this, Adam whispered, his voice shaky, his hand gripping Thomas's sleeve tightly. This is insane. What is happening? Why are these things in the mirror? But before Thomas could respond, the reflection of Adam appeared, twisted and ghostly. The smile on the reflection of Adam's face was dark, knowing, as if the version of his friend in the mirror had already seen the horrors of what was to come. Thomas felt a cold sweat break out across his brow as he watched his friend recoil. Look at it, Adam, Thomas said, his voice tight. Look at the reflection. It's not just some trick of the light. It's something worse. It's like the mirror is showing us a future we don't control. A future where we're trapped, lost. Adam swallowed hard. Oh, I don't know, man. This doesn't feel right. I mean, why would the mirror do this? What's the purpose? And now we are here. Well, I don't know, Thomas replied, the fear beginning to break through his calm exterior. But whatever it is, we have to stop it. I can't let it keep showing us, these versions of ourselves. We have to figure out what's going on before it consumes us. His rare incarnate lit up sides of him. Adam looked down, his eyes flickering with hesitation. But then, without another word, he stepped forward, placing a hand on the mirror's cold surface. For a moment, nothing happened. The mirror remained still, silent, as though it were waiting for them to make the next move. But then, suddenly, everything changed. The reflection in the mirror began to twist violently. Thomas stepped back in shock as he watched it distort and flicker like a broken television. His heart raced as a new reflection took shape. This time, it wasn't just him and Adam, but a reflection of the apartment itself, twisted and dark, as if the entire room had become a monstrous version of itself. The walls seemed to bend and warp, and the floor appeared to be sinking into a deep, endless void. In the corner of the reflection stood the man Thomas had once been, shattered, dishevelled and lost in a storm of confusion. The room behind him pulsed with an ominous red glow, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the floor. What the hell? Adam gasped, his voice barely audible, his eyes wide with terror. What is this? Why does it look like everything's falling apart? I don't know, Thomas shouted, his chest tightening. It's like the mirror is showing us the worst possible version of everything. We have to stop it. We have to break the cycle. But no matter how much he wanted to fight it, the reflection was relentless. It grew darker, more distorted. Thomas could feel it tugging at him, calling him to step forward, to enter the mirror, and lose himself in the version of reality that it was offering him. He fought against it, but the pull was strong, so strong that he could almost hear his own voice whispering to him, urging him to give in. Thomas, don't listen to it, Adam screamed, grabbing his arm. We can't let it take us. We have to break free. But as Adam tried to pull him away from the mirror, something strange happened. The reflection of Thomas in the glass smiled, its lips curling into a twisted grin. It reached out from the mirror, its hand passing through the glass like it wasn't there at all. Adam screamed, but before Thomas could react, the reflection grabbed his arm. Adam! Thomas shouted, his heart thundering in his chest. He tried to pull his friend away, but the grip of the mirror was too strong. In that moment, Thomas realized the terrifying truth. The mirror wasn't just reflecting alternate versions of them. It was pulling them into the world inside the glass. It wanted them to become part of it. and if they didn't act quickly, they would be consumed by it forever. Ben passed the mirror slowly, watching the glass disappear, clamoring towards them as it did. "Let him go!" Thomas roared, his mind racing. He reached out for Adam, gripping him tightly as the reflection of his own hand began to merge with the glass, pulling him forward. With a surge of desperation, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. He threw himself forward, his body crashing against the mirror with all the force he could muster. There was a sickening crack as the glass shattered into 1,000 shards, each one falling to the floor in slow motion. Time seemed to stop as the world around them collapsed into chaos. The darkness in the mirror receded, and the strange, twisted versions of themselves evaporated into the ether. The oppressive air lifted, and the room was still once again. The stars had moved on, now watching from the sky. Thomas stumbled back, his breathing ragged, his mind still reeling from the encounter. The mirror, once a prison, lay in pieces on the floor, its grip broken, its power shattered. Adam, wide-eyed and shaken, stood beside him, his hands trembling. "Uda, I think it's over," Thomas said softly, his voice barely a whisper. Adam nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, I think you're right. But what was that? What did we just do?" Thomas took a deep breath, his heart still racing. "I'm not sure, Adam, but I think we learned something. My dear, there is more." Adam looked at him, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "What do you mean?" "I mean that we can't let our fears, our darkest selves, control us. We can't let the mirrors show us what we're not." Thomas paused, looking down at the shards of glass scattered on the floor. "We have to be strong enough to see who we truly are, and not let the broken parts of us define us." The two stood there for a long time, the weight of their experience settling over them like a heavy fog. The mirrors and the versions of themselves they had seen were gone, but the lesson remained, one that would stay with them forever. My liberation. In that moment, Thomas realized that he had faced the darkness within and had emerged stronger for it. No mirror, no reflection could ever show him who he truly was. Only he could define that for himself. And with that understanding, he was finally free. But the journey wasn't over. There would be more challenges ahead, more reflections to face. But Thomas knew he was ready, because now he truly understood what it meant to face himself. The room was silent now, save for the soft rustle of glass shards as they settled on the floor. Thomas and Adam stood there, their hearts still pounding in their chests, the weight of what had just happened heavy in the air. The mirror, once an imposing and terrifying presence, lay in pieces at their feet. Its power, its hold over them, was broken, but the aftermath remained. The question now was what would happen next. Thomas took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The adrenaline was slowly wearing off, but the exhaustion was creeping in. He felt as though he had just run a marathon, and every inch of his body ached from the mental and emotional strain. His thoughts raced, trying to make sense of the ordeal, of the twisted reflections, and of the terrifying grip the mirror had had on both of them. He looked at Adam, whose eyes were still wide with shock, as though he were waiting for the world to collapse around them again. Adam's hands were trembling, and he wiped them on his pants nervously. "Are we really safe now?" Adam asked, his voice a mix of fear and disbelief. Thomas didn't immediately answer. Instead, he glanced around the room, his gaze falling on the jagged shards of glass scattered across the floor. He thought about the reflections they had seen, each one more distorted and haunting than the last. And he thought about the version of himself that had reached out from the mirror, the version that had almost claimed him entirely. "I think so," Thomas said finally, his voice steady but uncertain. "At least, I hope so. The mirror's broken. The versions of us, it can't trap us anymore. But I don't know if it's truly gone, Or if it'll come back in some other way. Adam nodded slowly, his expression still clouded with doubt. What if it's not over? What if it comes back? What if there are more mirrors out there, waiting to pull us in? Thomas felt a chill run down his spine at the thought. The idea that they might not be free, that something else was lurking in the shadows, was unsettling. But he knew one thing. If the mirror had taught him anything, it was that he couldn't live in fear of what might happen. The only thing he could control was how he responded. "We'll deal with it," Thomas said, his voice firm. "Together." Adam seemed to draw strength from his words, nodding in agreement. "Yeah, together." The two of them stood there for a moment longer, the weight of the situation sinking in. They had faced something unimaginable, something that threatened to unravel their sense of self. But they had survived. They had faced the darkness, and though it had nearly consumed them, they were still standing, and that was something worth holding on to. Thomas walked over to the window and looked outside. The city, bathed in the soft light of the setting sun, seemed so peaceful from here. The hustle and bustle of everyday life continued outside, but inside, the world had been changed forever. Thomas knew that he couldn't go back to the way things had been. The mirror, with all its versions of himself and Adam, had forced him to confront parts of himself he'd been avoiding for years. But it had also shown him something else. A way out. A path forward. 11 p.m. "I think we need to leave this place," Thomas said, his voice quiet but determined. Adam looked at him, his brow furrowing. "Leave? Where will we go? What if the mirror comes back?" Thomas turned back to face his friend, his eyes clear. "We won't be running. We'll be moving forward. We'll leave this behind and we'll start fresh. Whatever happens, we'll face it together, like we always have." Adam's eyes softened. "Yeah, I guess you're right. We can't stay here forever. We have to move on." Thomas smiled, feeling the weight of the past few hours lift just a little. "Exactly. We can't let fear control us. We have to move forward, together." The two of them spent the next few hours cleaning up the glass and taking stock of the situation. It was a quiet process, one filled with introspection and a sense of finality. They didn't need to talk much. Everything that needed to be said had already been said. The mirror had shown them the worst versions of themselves, but in the end, it had also shown them something more important: the strength they had within, the bond they shared, and the power of choice. As they finished cleaning, Thomas looked around the room one last time. He had thought that the mirror had been a curse, but now he saw it as a lesson. A harsh, painful lesson, but one that had taught him more than he ever could have imagined. Not denying. "So, what now?" Adam asked, breaking the silence. His voice was quieter now, but there was a hint of optimism in it that hadn't been there before. Thomas took a deep breath and smiled. "Now we move forward. We face the world and everything in it, knowing that we can handle whatever comes our way. And if the mirror tries to pull us in again, we'll be ready." Adam grinned, a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Yeah, we'll be ready." They left the apartment together, side by side. The world outside was vast, full of possibility. They had no idea what would come next, what challenges or obstacles awaited them. But for the first time in a long while, Thomas felt a sense of peace. He had faced the mirror, had confronted the versions of himself he'd feared, and had come out stronger on the other side. There were no more reflections to hide behind. There was only the real world, and only the choices they would make. And with that, Thomas knew he was ready. Reaching out, Thomas knew he was ready. As they stepped out into the world, the sunlight warm on their faces, they walked forward, not as the men the mirror had chosen to be, but as the men they had chosen to be. As they stepped out into the world, the sunlight warm on their faces, they walked forward, not as the men the mirror had chosen to be. The city was alive with its usual hum, but to Thomas, it felt different now. Every street corner, every familiar face seemed somehow more real. The chaotic bustle of people rushing from one place to another no longer overwhelmed him. Instead, it reminded him that they were all just trying to make their way through life, just like he and Adam. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Thomas realized that he had control over his own path. No more shadows of alternate versions, no more fears of being trapped in the wrong identity. Where do we go from here? Adam's voice broke through his thoughts. Thomas glanced at his friend, seeing the same uncertainty that had clouded their minds earlier, but also something else. Hope. A glimmer of confidence, like they had both just survived a storm and were ready to find a safe harbor. I don't know yet, Thomas replied, but wherever it is, I know I'll be okay, and we'll be okay. He turned to Adam with a knowing smile. We survived that, we can survive anything. Adam nodded, though there was still a hint of unease in his eyes. But Thomas could tell he was starting to believe it, starting to see the world with new eyes, just like Thomas had. The reflections of the mirror might have fractured their sense of self for a moment, but now the world was full of new beginnings. They walked through the streets, past the shops, the bustling cafes and quiet parks, and Thomas felt a weight lift from his chest with each step. As they passed people who were caught up in their own lives, he noticed something he hadn't before. How much everyone else was wrapped up in their own stories, their own struggles, their own reflections. Some were carrying burdens they hid well, others wore their scars for all to see. But they were all simply people, just trying to navigate their worlds, just as he and Adam were. It was then that Thomas realized something profound. The mirror hadn't just shown them other versions of themselves, it had shown them how they saw themselves in relation to the world. It wasn't just about the distortions in the glass, but the way they viewed their own possibilities. The mirror had been their fear, their doubts, their insecurities. Suddenly he recognized her, but now that it was shattered, they could see that the world had endless reflections to offer, not in glass, but in the people they met and the choices they made. What if we don't have all the answers? Adam asked quietly, his voice thoughtful. Don't, Thomas replied, chuckling softly. But we don't need them. Life's about figuring things out as you go. It's not about having a perfect plan. It's about choosing the right steps to take, even when the path isn't clear. Adam smiled, and Thomas could see the weight lift from his shoulders. It wasn't about controlling every aspect of life. It was about moving forward, even when the future was uncertain. The real power, Thomas thought, wasn't in controlling the world around them. It was in how they chose to react to it. As they continued their walk, Thomas found himself appreciating the small things, the rhythm of life that had once been overwhelming. He noticed the rustling of leaves in the trees, the distant sound of music drifting from a nearby cafe, the laughter of children playing in the park. It was as if the world had become clearer, brighter, and more colourful, free from the haze of self-doubt and confusion the mirror had created. They stopped by a small cafe, its cosy atmosphere welcoming them like a second home. The warm scent of coffee and fresh pastries filled the air. The place was busy, but there was something calming about the hum of quiet conversations, the clink of coffee cups, and the steady movement of people coming and going. How about we sit down for a bit? Thomas suggested, gesturing toward an empty table by the window. It's been a crazy day. We could use a break. Adam nodded, and the two of them took a seat. As they sipped their drinks, the world outside continued on, unaffected by the chaos they had just endured. But to them, it felt like everything had shifted. They had faced their darkest fears and come out stronger. The mirror had tried to twist their identities, but in the end, it had revealed something much more important: their resilience, their bond, and the power of self-acceptance. So, Adam said after a moment, breaking the silence, what do we do now? Thomas leaned back in his chair, considering the question. The possibilities felt endless, and yet they both knew that whatever they chose next, it would be a choice made in the light of everything they had learned. We keep living, Thomas replied. We keep making choices. Maybe we don't have all the answers, but that's okay. We've learned that the journey is just as important as the destination. Adam smiled, his eyes lighting up with a mix of relief and excitement. Yeah, We've learned a lot. Thomas raised his cup, toasting to the future, to the new possibilities, and to the strength they had found in the face of their fears. The road ahead was unknown, and that was okay. The mirror had shattered, but it had left behind something far more powerful, a sense of clarity, a bond forged in fire, and a deep understanding that they were the masters of their own stories. As they sat there, surrounded by the world's noise and life, they knew one thing for certain. They had come through the storm together, and no reflection, no mirror could ever take that away from them. With that, they walked out of the cafe, stepping into the future, ready to face whatever came their way, together. As Thomas and Adam walked out of the cafe, the bright sunlight bathed the city streets, and for the first time in a long while, Thomas felt the weight of the past lift completely. The reflections in the mirror no longer haunted him, nor did they define him. The only reflection that mattered now was the one that stared back at him through his actions and decisions. He wasn't perfect, and he didn't need to be, but he was real, and that was more than enough. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Adam said, his voice full of quiet wonder as he looked around at the world with new eyes. "We sure have," Thomas replied, a soft smile tugging at his lips. "And we're just getting started." The sounds of the city surrounded them. Cars honking, people chatting, the distant hum of a subway train. But for Thomas, it was all background noise. In that moment, it felt like the world had slowed down just for them, as if the universe was allowing them a moment of peace to reflect on everything they had been through. Every step they had taken in the last few days had brought them to this very point, stronger, more certain, and more connected to each other than ever before. "Do you think we'll ever understand what happened with the mirrors?" Adam asked, his voice thoughtful. He was looking at Thomas now, his brow furrowed in contemplation. "What?" Thomas paused for a moment, considering the question. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew that what mattered most was not understanding the mystery of the mirrors, but understanding themselves. The mirrors had shown them multiple versions of their lives, distorted and twisted by fear, regret, and confusion. But in the end, those reflections didn't define them. It was the choices they made, the actions they took that mattered. "I don't think we need to understand it all," Thomas said finally, his voice steady. "Maybe the mirrors were just a way for us to face our fears, to see what we might have become if we let ourselves fall into doubt. But that's not who we are anymore, is it?" Adam nodded slowly, and for a moment, both of them stood there in quiet agreement. They had faced the darkness within themselves, and now they were ready to embrace the light. "We don't need to know why the mirrors existed," Thomas continued, his words strong and resolute. "What matters is that we learned from it. We learned who we really are. And that's what matters moving forward." Adam smiled, his eyes lighting up with a new sense of clarity. "You're right. It's not the reflections that matter. It's who we choose to be." As they walked down the street, they passed by a group of street performers playing a lively tune on guitars and drums. The music filled the air, adding a touch of lightness to the moment. Thomas glanced at Adam and saw a glimmer of excitement in his friend's eyes. It was clear that, for both of them, the future now held endless possibilities. "We should make some memories," Thomas said, suddenly feeling the urge to do something spontaneous. "Why not take a detour? Let's enjoy the day." Adam's face broke into a grin. "Sounds like a great idea. What should we do first?" "This feels right," Adam said after a while, his voice quiet but content. Thomas nodded, feeling the same sense of peace wash over him. There was no need for words. They both understood that the journey they had been on, facing their fears, confronting their pasts, and learning to live with the uncertainty of life, had brought them to this moment of quiet satisfaction. They had come to realize that life didn't need to be controlled or predicted. It was enough to be present, to choose to move forward, to create their own path. They had learned the value of embracing uncertainty and accepting that they couldn't change everything. What mattered was the here and now, the connections they made, and the choices they took with each new day. "You know," Thomas said, breaking the silence, "I think we'll be okay." Adam looked at him, a soft smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, I think so too." And for the first time in a long time, Thomas didn't feel the need to worry about what might come next. They had faced the mirror's distortions and come out stronger for it. Now they could walk forward with confidence, knowing that they were in control of their own reflections. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and purple, Thomas and Adam sat side by side, ready to face whatever the world would throw at them. They had learned that the most important thing wasn't the version of themselves they saw in the mirror. It was the version of themselves they chose to become. And in that moment, they both knew that they had become exactly who they were meant to be. With that thought, they stood up from the bench, side by side, and walked into the night, ready to embrace the future, one step at a time. As Thomas and Adam walked through the streets, the cool evening air wrapped around them like a soft embrace, signaling the end of their day, but not the end of their journey. The city lights flickered to life, casting long shadows that stretched across the pavement, creating a sense of both mystery and excitement. As Thomas and Adam walked through the town, she felt a warmth creating a sense of both mystery and excitement. They were no longer weighed down by the confusion and distortions that the mirrors had shown them. They had made peace with themselves, their pasts, and the infinite versions of what could have been. But there was still so much more to explore. "I've been thinking," Adam said, breaking the comfortable silence between them. His voice was low, but there was a clear sense of purpose in it. "We've learned so much, but there's one thing we haven't figured out." Thomas glanced at his friend, his curiosity piqued. "What's that? Why did the mirrors show us all those different versions of ourselves?" Adam asked, his brows furrowing. "What was the point? I mean, we've grown from it, sure, but there has to be a bigger reason for it, right?" Thomas paused, reflecting on the question. He had asked himself the same thing many times since the mirrors had first appeared. He had spent hours, even days, trying to find answers, but there was no simple explanation. The mirrors were a riddle, a puzzle that didn't seem to have an easy solution. "I think," Thomas began slowly, "that maybe the point wasn't to find an answer. Maybe it was about learning to embrace uncertainty." Adam stopped walking and looked at him. "Embrace uncertainty," he repeated, almost as if testing the words in his mouth. "Yeah," Thomas said, nodding thoughtfully. "We were so focused on finding a clear, defined version of ourselves, something that made sense. But what we needed was to realize that life isn't about being one thing or another. It's about accepting that we can be many things at once. And that's okay." Adam seemed to mull over this for a moment, his gaze drifting to the streetlights that lined the sidewalk, their warm glow reflecting off the wet pavement. Then a soft smile curved his lips. "You're right," he said quietly. "Maybe we've been trying to put ourselves in a box when there's no box. We're not one version of ourselves, we're all of them." "Exactly," Thomas said, feeling a sense of relief wash over him. It was as if the final piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. Maybe the mirrors weren't trying to show us the right version of ourselves. Maybe they were showing us all the possibilities, who we could be, who we were, and who we had the potential to become. But the truth is, we get to decide that. It's our choice. Adam let out a deep breath, as if the weight of their journey had finally lifted, leaving behind only a sense of peace and understanding. "That feels freeing, he said, his voice tinged with wonder. "I don't need to know who I am or who I'll be. I just need to keep living and let those versions of me unfold as I go." Thomas smiled, feeling a warmth spread through his chest. He had spent so much of his life trying to make sense of who he was, trying to fit into one version of himself, when the reality was far more beautiful and complex than that. There was freedom in accepting the unknown, in allowing himself to be many things, in realizing that the journey itself was just as important as the destination. They continued walking, the city humming around them, But for the first time, the chaos felt calm. It wasn't a loud, overwhelming noise. It was simply life, unfolding in its own way. The crowds, the cars, the conversations, all of it was part of the world they now felt connected to, no longer apart from. They had found their place, not by trying to define themselves in a rigid way, but by allowing themselves to experience everything that came their way, both the good and the bad. As they reached a quiet park, the two of them sat down on a bench beneath a tall oak tree. The leaves rustled gently in the breeze, and the stars began to peek through the darkening sky, a silent reminder of the vastness of the universe. They sat in silence for a while, just taking it all in. "Do you think we'll ever know all the answers?" Adam asked eventually, breaking the silence once more. His voice was thoughtful, almost wistful. "I don't know," Thomas said with a shrug. "But maybe that's not what matters. Maybe the questions themselves are enough. It's the journey that makes us who we are, not the destination or the answers." Adam nodded slowly, looking up at the sky, as if the stars held the key to all the mysteries of the universe. "I think I'm okay with that. I think I'm okay with just living and seeing where it takes me." "Me too," Thomas agreed. "We don't have to have it all figured out. As long as we're open to what comes next, we'll be just fine." The cool night air wrapped around them, comforting and familiar. The city was still alive with energy, but in this moment, everything felt still. They had both learned to let go of the need for answers, the need to control their futures, and that was enough. Whatever happened next, they knew they would face it together, not as fixed versions of themselves, but as two people who had learned to embrace the uncertainty of life and find strength in it. As they sat there, side by side, watching the stars twinkle above, the world felt vast and full of possibility. They were ready, not to conquer the world, but to simply live in it, free, unburdened, and open to the endless versions of themselves that lay ahead. And for the first time in a long time, Thomas felt truly at peace. He didn't need to search for the right reflection. He had already found it, in his actions, in his choices, and in the person he was becoming. Together they stood up from the bench, ready to continue their journey, one step at a time, wherever it might lead. The future was uncertain, but it was theirs to shape, and that, Thomas realized, was the greatest gift of all. As they walked through the park, the city's hum felt distant now, almost like a whisper in the background. The crisp night air, the soft rustle of leaves in the trees, the occasional laugh from people passing by, it all blended into a calming symphony, each sound adding a layer of tranquility to the moment. Thomas and Adam walked side by side, not saying much, but feeling the weight of everything they had experienced together. It wasn't the kind of conversation where words needed to fill the silence. It was the kind of quiet where the shared understanding between them was enough. They reached a small bridge that arched over a quiet stream. The water below shimmered in the moonlight, reflecting the stars in a soft, dreamlike glow. Adam leaned against the railing, looking down into the water, his thoughts once again far away. "This place," Adam murmured, "it's peaceful. I think I needed something like this after everything. You know, it's like we've been through the storm, and now we're here, on the other side." Thomas joined him at the railing, looking down at the water too. Yeah, the chaos of those mirrors, the constant questioning of who we are, who we could have been, it's exhausting. But now everything feels simpler. Adam turned to face him, his expression thoughtful. "I guess we can only see the pieces when we step back. Huh? When we let go of trying to control them, they come together in their own way." Thomas nodded slowly. "Exactly. It's like trying to make sense of a puzzle without forcing the pieces into place. Sometimes the pieces don't fit, unless you let them fall into place naturally." They stood there for a long time, watching the water ripple gently, both lost in their thoughts. The world felt still and complete, and the weight of their earlier struggles had finally begun to fade, replaced by a quiet, lasting peace. "We don't have to have it all figured out," Thomas said. breaking the silence. Haha, maybe that's the point. Just let life happen and we'll figure out who we are along the way. When there are not wild beasts in Gaza, Dom and I might be the only warrior people there, Adam smiled. A genuine, easy smile that made his eyes light up. I like that. I think it's time we stop searching for answers that might not even exist. It's okay not to know everything. Yeah, Thomas agreed, feeling a lightness in his chest, as if a burden had been lifted. It's okay to just be. They turned to walk back through the park, the city lights now casting a warm, golden glow along the path. It was late, but neither of them felt like going home yet. There was no rush anymore, no urgency to find the next step, no need to figure out their lives. They were content, and for the first time in a long time, that was enough. As they walked, Thomas realized something else. The mirrors had shown him something important. It wasn't just about finding the right version of himself or figuring out what choices he had made. It was about understanding that he didn't need to fix everything. The reflections had taught him that he could be different things at different times, that he could grow, change, and still be true to himself. They passed a small cafe, its windows glowing with warm light, and Adam glanced at Thomas, raising an eyebrow. Want to grab a coffee? Thomas chuckled. Sure, why not? They stepped inside the cafe, the warm, inviting scent of coffee and pastries filling the air. It was quiet, a few patrons seated at tables, but the atmosphere was peaceful, cozy. They found a small table by the window and sat down, both feeling a little lighter than they had before. What's next for you? Adam asked as they sipped their coffee. Do you think you'll ever go back to those mirrors? Or, I don't think I need to, Thomas replied, his gaze drifting to the window. I've learned what I needed to. I know who I am now, and if I change again, well, that's okay too. Adam smiled, as if he understood exactly what Thomas meant. I think we're both figuring it out as we go, and that's more than enough, Thomas grinned, feeling a warmth spread through him. The path ahead wasn't clear, but for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to see it all. He didn't need the mirrors, the reflections, or the answers. What mattered was the present, the now, and all the endless possibilities it held. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the last few days lift off his shoulders, replaced by a quiet optimism. There was freedom in knowing that he didn't have to be defined by a single moment, a single version of himself. He could be anyone he wanted to be, anyone he chose to become, and for the first time in a long time, Thomas felt truly alive. Then, sit. They stayed at the cafe for a while, talking about small things, life and the future. It wasn't about solving problems or finding answers anymore. It was about enjoying the ride, the shared moments, and the beauty of what was unfolding. The mirrors were behind them, their purpose fulfilled, and now they could move forward into the unknown together. As they left the cafe, the city had begun to settle into the quiet of the night, and Thomas realized that for all the confusion and chaos of the past, there was a simple truth he had discovered. He didn't need to know everything. He didn't need to be perfect. He just needed to be himself, in whatever form that took. And with that, he stepped into the night, his heart light, his spirit free, and the road ahead wide open with possibility. As they stepped out of the cafe, the cool night air wrapped around them, refreshing and alive with possibility. The streetlights cast long shadows, their soft golden light reflecting on the wet pavement from the recent rain. The world felt clean, like it had been washed and renewed, much like how Thomas felt inside. Adam nudged him playfully, breaking the comfortable silence. You know, for someone who just went through a whole existential crisis, you're looking pretty good. Thomas laughed, the sound more free than it had been in a long time. I think that's what happens when you finally let go of trying to control everything, he said, a soft smile playing on his lips. It's like everything just settles. I get that, Adam said, his voice thoughtful. We're always so focused on what we could have been or what we should be that we forget to just live, right? Thomas nodded, his gaze drifting up to the night sky. The stars shone brighter than he had expected. The vastness of the sky seemed to mirror his thoughts, endless and full of potential. It's strange, Thomas said quietly. I spent so much time trying to figure out who I was, and now I realize it's not about finding one version of myself. It's about being comfortable with all of them. Adam stopped walking for a moment, turning to face him fully. His expression was earnest, and Thomas could see the weight of his own experiences reflected there. You've come a long way, man, Adam said, a touch of admiration in his voice. Maybe we both have, and who knows, maybe the versions of ourselves we think we need to be, they're not so important. It's the journey, the changes along the way that matter. Thomas met Adam's eyes, seeing not just his friend, but someone who had also wrestled with the same questions, someone who had come out the other side stronger and more self-aware. Yeah, Thomas agreed. Maybe we're all just trying to figure it out, one step at a time. And that's okay. They continued walking down the street, the weight of the past few days behind them, and the future ahead, uncertain but full of promise. The city around them seemed to fade into the background as they walked, in companionable silence, each man lost in his own thoughts, but tethered together by their shared journey. Eventually, they reached the park again, where they had started their walk earlier. You know, Adam said after a long pause, I think we both needed this. Not just the reflections, but the time to just be. To realize that we can change and still be who we are. Thomas turned to him, a faint smile playing at his lips. I think I understand now. You can't just keep looking for the right version of yourself. You have to live through each version, each phase, and let it teach you something. Adam nodded. Exactly. It's like a journey, not a destination. They reached the bench they had sat on earlier, and Adam sat down, looking out over the park, the peaceful quiet surrounding them. Thomas joined him, sitting a little closer this time, comfortable in the stillness. For a long while, they simply watched the world around them, the way the trees shifted in the wind, the way the city hummed just beyond the park, and the way the sky seemed to stretch on forever. There was something beautiful in the quiet, in the simplicity of the moment. As the night deepened, Thomas found that he wasn't rushing to figure out the next step. He wasn't anxious about what came next. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was content just to be in the moment. As the first sign of the moon rising through a sky that would soon be the last day of rising school. Do you think we'll ever have everything figured out? Thomas asked quietly, his voice filled with a mix of curiosity and acceptance. Adam's answer came after a moment of contemplation. Maybe not everything, but that's okay. Some things are meant to remain unknown, and some things, they reveal themselves over time. Thomas smiled at that. A soft, knowing smile. Yeah, maybe that's the point. To let life unfold as it will, without the pressure of having to control it all. Time. Here's to the journey, Adam said, raising an imaginary glass. I need a frothy. Thomas laughed, clinking his own invisible glass with his friends. To the journey, he agreed, feeling the warmth of that simple truth settle in his chest. The journey wasn't about finding answers or chasing perfection. It wasn't about mirrors reflecting a singular truth. It was about embracing each moment, each experience, and growing along the way. So, as they sat there in silence, the world seemed to stretch out before them, full of possibilities. Whatever came next didn't matter so much. They had already begun to understand what truly mattered, being present, accepting the unknown, and living authentically. With a final glance at the stars above, Thomas stood up. Let's keep moving forward, wherever it leads. Adam stood too, stretching his arms and smiling. Yeah, let's do it. And together they walked into the night, knowing that the road ahead was unknown, but that was the beauty of it. They didn't need to have all the answers. They just needed to keep moving forward, one step at a time, As they walked, the world around them seemed to hum with the possibilities of what lay ahead. The crisp night air felt almost electric, as if the universe itself was waiting to see what they would do next. The city, with its endless streets and towering buildings, felt both vast and intimate, a backdrop for the decisions they were making, the paths they would take. "Do you ever wonder," Thomas began, his voice thoughtful, "how many versions of ourselves exist in this world? Like, we're all walking around with so many different faces, right? The ones we show others, the ones we hide from ourselves, and the ones we don't even realize are there." Adam looked over at him, considering the question. He slowed his pace, matching Thomas's, as if the weight of the thought deserved more attention. "Yeah, I get that. It's like we're all wearing masks, aren't we? Sometimes we don't even know who's wearing the mask. We just put it on and go through the motions." Thomas smiled softly, the corners of his mouth turning up. "And sometimes we wear too many masks at once, forgetting who we really are underneath." The two of them walked for a few minutes, the silence between them filled with the quiet contemplation of their own reflections. It felt strange, like they were both looking at the world through new eyes, finally understanding what had been hidden in plain sight all along. A voice began calling their names. "Isn't it funny how, for so long, I thought the answers were outside of me?" Thomas said, his words almost a whisper. "I kept thinking I had to find some version of myself in the past, or in someone else, or in a mirror. But maybe the truth is, it was always inside me." Adam stopped walking for a moment, then turned to face Thomas, his expression serious but understanding. "It's like we're constantly evolving, right? We change with every experience, every choice we make. So maybe there isn't just one version of us that matters. It's all the versions, each one, a piece of who we are becoming." Thomas thought about this for a moment, the weight of it sinking in. Yeah, every time we take a step forward or fall back, we're creating a new version of ourselves. And that's okay. It's part of the journey. He glanced up at the sky, where the stars had started to fade behind the encroaching light of dawn. The first faint glow of morning was beginning to paint the horizon in soft hues of pink and orange. The city, still wrapped in the embrace of night, began to stir, as if it too was waking up from a long slumber. "You know," Adam said, after a long pause, his voice taking on a tone of resolve, "I think it's all about embracing change, whether it's the version of yourself in the mirror or the one you're becoming. We can't be afraid to evolve." Thomas nodded, feeling the truth of that in his bones. "I guess we're all just trying to get comfortable with who we are, but maybe we have to be okay with who we're not, too." Adam laughed softly, the sound rich with the understanding of their shared realization. "That's the hardest part, right? Letting go of the expectations and just being who we are, not who we think we should be." 9. They stood together for a moment, just watching as the sun slowly began to rise, casting its golden light over the streets they had just walked. The world, in its quiet way, was beginning to reveal itself anew, just as they had. The city's rhythm, the hum of life, all felt like a reflection of their own shifting, growing selves. "I think," Thomas said, his voice quieter now, "that we're both starting to get it. The mirrors, the different versions. They're not about showing us who we're supposed to be. They're just showing us where we've been, where we're going, and everything in between." Adam grinned, nudging him lightly with his elbow. "I'm glad you figured it out, man. Took you long enough, huh?" Thomas chuckled, his heart lighter than it had been in days. "Yeah, well, I guess some things take time, but I'm starting to see the bigger picture now. And it's not so scary anymore." Emma gave her a wink. As they began walking again, the morning light now fully illuminating the streets, it felt like the world was opening up to them. No longer constrained by the pressures of finding a single perfect version of themselves, they were free to embrace the many faces they wore, and in doing so, they discovered something deeper, that their true selves were not confined to one reflection, but stretched across time, choices, and experiences. And so they walked on, side by side, as the world continued to change around them. Together, they embraced the uncertainty, knowing that the beauty of life lay not in finding one fixed version of themselves, but in the many versions they would continue to become. As the morning progressed, the streets seemed to wake up in rhythm with their new understanding. The world, still soft with the early glow of dawn, felt both familiar and fresh at the same time. Thomas and Adam walked in silence for a while, their feet tapping against the sidewalk, their minds racing with new thoughts and ideas. They had reached a quiet understanding, one that had settled deep within them, but there was still much to process. "You know," Thomas said after a few moments, his voice thoughtful, "I think we spend so much time trying to control who we are, trying to box ourselves into one version, that we forget how to live freely." Adam nodded in agreement. "Exactly. We're so busy trying to be the best version of ourselves that we forget we're already a version of ourselves. Right here, right now. We don't need to be perfect." Thomas smiled, appreciating the simplicity of Adam's words. It was true. Life wasn't about being perfect. It was about being real, authentic, and learning to embrace who they were, even in all their flaws and complexities. The man they saw in the mirror didn't have to be flawless. They could change, evolve, and make mistakes, and still they were enough. As they reached a small cafe on the corner, the smell of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries greeted them. The cafe had an inviting, cozy vibe, and the soft chatter of morning patrons filled the air. They stepped inside, the bell above the door ringing gently as they made their way to a table by the window. The waitress greeted them with a warm smile and handed them menus. Adam scanned his menu quickly before looking up at Thomas. "What are you getting?" Thomas paused, his fingers tracing the edge of the menu absent-mindedly. He was thinking about how the choices on the menu felt similar to the choices they made in life. So many options, so many ways to go. "Maybe just coffee for now," he said with a smile. "I don't need anything too complicated today." Adam chuckled, shaking his head. "That's you, all right. Always keeping it simple." They both laughed, and for a moment it felt like everything had fallen into place. The weight of their earlier revelations wasn't heavy anymore. Instead, it felt like freedom, a freedom to choose, to evolve, and to live fully in each moment. Their waitress returned, taking their orders and bringing them their coffee. The warmth of the mugs felt comforting in their hands. As they sipped, the conversation drifted. They talked about nothing in particular, enjoying the lightness of the moment. There was no rush to get anywhere, no pressure to solve the world's problems, just two friends sharing a morning, sharing an understanding. "Do you ever think about what comes next?" Thomas asked, his voice quieter now, more reflective. Adam glanced up, considering the question. "I used to, a lot. I thought I had to have everything figured out, you know? But now, I don't know. I'm more focused on being present, in the moment, rather than constantly worrying about the future." "Ja da." Thomas nodded. He had been that person. Always planning, always seeking control over the future, thinking that if he just figured everything out, everything would fall into place. But now, in the space between reflections and mirrors, he understood. It wasn't about knowing the answers before the questions came. It was about embracing the unknown. "Maybe the only version of ourselves we need to worry about," Thomas said slowly, "is the one we are right now." Adam's eyes met his, a knowing look passing between them. "Yeah, we've spent so much time chasing after the perfect version of ourselves, when all along it's been about this moment, who we are right here, right now." They both sat back, taking in the simplicity of the moment. The cafe hummed with life, the outside world carrying on, but in that small space, it felt as if everything had aligned. They were content with the present, no longer searching for something more. Something else. It wasn't about figuring everything out. It was about being who they were, in all their contradictions, all their imperfections. The person they saw in the mirror, whether it was a version full of doubt, joy, sorrow, or hope, was part of them. All the versions mattered. not just the way they chose to face the world. "We don't have to be afraid of change anymore," Thomas said, his voice quiet but firm. "We can embrace it. We can welcome every version of ourselves." Adam raised his mug in a small toast, a grin spreading across his face. "To the versions of us we've yet to meet." He took a hard sip of his beer. Thomas raised his mug, clinking it gently against Adam's. "And to the ones we're becoming." They sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the world outside fading into the background. The future no longer seemed uncertain, just open. Endless possibilities lay ahead of them, and for the first time, they weren't afraid of what they might find. It wasn't the mirrors or the reflections that defined them, it was their willingness to grow, to evolve, and to accept the beauty of every version they became. And in that acceptance, they found peace. As they finished their coffee and prepared to leave, the world outside felt different. It wasn't that anything had changed, necessarily, but they had. They had come to terms with who they were, and in doing so, they had unlocked the freedom to become whoever they wanted to be next. The road ahead was long, but it was theirs to walk together. As they stepped out of the cafe and into the cool morning air, the city around them seemed to pulse with life. Its busy streets filled with people hurrying to their destinations, the hum of traffic, the distant sounds of construction and conversation. But for Thomas and Adam, everything felt quieter now, calmer. The noise outside was there, but it no longer felt overwhelming. "Where do we go from here?" Adam asked, his hands stuffed into the pockets of his jacket. His question was more reflective than practical, as if he was wondering where this newfound understanding would take them. Thomas smiled, taking a deep breath. The air felt different, almost refreshing. "I don't know," he admitted, "but that's okay, I think. For the first time in a while, I'm okay with not knowing." Adam laughed softly. You're right. Maybe it's not about having a plan anymore. Maybe it's just about being. Just being who we are." They walked for a while longer, side by side, their conversation fading into a comfortable silence. The world around them moved at its usual pace, but their thoughts lingered on what they had just realized, how important it was to let go of the need to control everything, the need to have every part of their lives mapped out, the need to always be perfect. In that moment, Thomas couldn't help but think of the many mirrors in his life, the ones he had used to measure himself, to judge himself. He had spent years staring into those reflections, expecting to find a version of himself that was whole, complete, and perfectly in control. "You know," Thomas said suddenly, breaking the silence, "I've spent so much time trying to make sure I was the right version of myself, the smart one, the successful one, the perfect one. But none of those versions felt real. They were just masks." Adam glanced at him, his expression understanding. "Yeah, we wear those masks without even realizing it. But the real version of us, it's the one beneath all of that, the one that's messy, uncertain, and sometimes lost, but also the one that's human." Thomas nodded. The weight he had carried for so long seemed to lift, just a little, with those words. It was okay to be uncertain. It was okay to make mistakes. It was okay to not have everything figured out. They found themselves walking toward the park, the place they always seemed to go when they didn't know where else to turn. The trees there were starting to show the first signs of spring, their branches slowly filling with buds, as if they too were shedding old versions of themselves to make way for new growth. Adam stopped at a bench near a large oak tree and sat down, stretching his legs out in front of him. "Maybe we should just take a break for now," he said, his voice light. "We've been through a lot today," Thomas agreed, sitting down beside him. "I think that's the first time in a long time I've felt like I could actually relax." As they sat in the park, surrounded by the quiet buzz of the city and the budding trees, Thomas realized something important. It wasn't just about the version of himself that he had seen in the mirror that morning. It was about embracing the fact that he could be all versions of himself, that he could evolve, change, and adapt as needed. And each version would be real. Each version would be him. For so long he had tried to chase after perfection, trying to hold on to a fixed identity. But now he saw the beauty in the fluidity of it all. The mirrors no longer felt like prisons, reflecting only one fixed version of him. Instead, they were windows into the many possibilities that lay within him, waiting to be discovered. "Do you think we'll ever stop changing?" Thomas asked, his voice soft, as if the question had been on his mind for some time. Adam thought about it for a moment before responding. "I don't know, but I think that's the point, isn't it? Change is what keeps us alive. It's what keeps us growing. We're always evolving. If we stop changing, we stop living." Thomas smiled at that. Adam's words were simple, yet profound. It was okay to be in a constant state of flux. It was okay to change, to shift, to be different from who he was yesterday. That was life. That was the journey. As they sat there, watching the world around them continue to turn, Thomas felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over him. For the first time in a long time, he was no longer afraid of the unknown. The future didn't need to be planned out. It didn't need to be perfect. All he had to do was show up, whoever he was in that moment. "You know," Thomas said, turning to Adam with a grin, "I think I'm starting to enjoy the mystery of it all." Adam laughed, his eyes lighting up with understanding. "Me too. Who knew that embracing the unknown could feel so freeing?" Together they sat in silence, the weight of their shared realization settling comfortably between them. The world was full of mirrors, each one showing a different version of themselves, but for the first time they understood. It wasn't the reflections that mattered. It was the freedom to be whoever they needed to be in that moment. And with that understanding, they were ready for whatever came next. The journey to self-acceptance is not about striving for perfection or trying to fit into a single version of ourselves. It's about embracing the many versions of who we are, knowing that change and growth are natural parts of life. Each moment is an opportunity to evolve, and we are always enough, no matter where we are on our journey.